Good evening.
Good evening. Good afternoon here. Good evening to you.
Dan, you can do the introduction now.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody, from our lunch hour, at least lunch hour here in Vancouver and Pacific time. So we have a paper session now on your program. You should be able to find a brief introduction here. We have three presenters, and I'll briefly give their titles, their affiliations, and the titles of their presentations. We will have approximately 13 minutes for each presenter to discuss their research, and we'll then follow up with approximately a 10-minute Q&A session. I will, during the presentations, I will be writing down your questions, so please add them through the text feature, and then what we'll do is we will then field those to the presenters. So the order of the presentation today will be starting with Piers, then Jeremy, and then Allison. The presenters, you can just go from one presenter to the next. I won't interject between presentations. You can just go in order. So I'll briefly give you an introduction. So our first presenter is Dr. Piers. Piers is with the Buckinghamshire New University, and his title of his presentation is A Positive Psychology Response to the Psychological Impact of the COVID Pandemic. Our second presenter is Jeremy Clifton, Dr. Jeremy Clifton. He is at the Parents intuit incorrectly that teaching their children that the world is a bad place is likely best for them. And then finally is we have Allison, Dr. Allison Parente. Am I pronouncing that right? Parente?
Parente, not a doctor,
Parente,
not yet.
Parente. Okay, you're okay. And she had a paper with numerous other contributors, but Allison is at the Farleigh Dickinson University. So thank you all for being here today. Again, we'll start with Piers. Go ahead, Piers.
Thanks very much. As you guessed from how I came in, it's evening this end. Sorry for the rather bright light behind me, but it's the best I can do. Okay, I was hoping to share my slides. Is there a way? I don't know what your screen is showing.
You should be able to share screen, Piers, in Zoom.
It's not working my end. So what I'd recommend is that I'll just talk to the slides. If you've got a better suggestion, that's fine. At the moment, on my screen, it's a big black screen with Daniel Jordan's name on it. So,
okay. Well, we do have a we have a technician here. I will have Tim. His name is. I'll have Tim try to fix that so that you can share your screen with the audience.
Well, I tell you what, let's make the first priority to have a face rather than a big black screen. But anyway, given I've only got 13 minutes, I did actually think I'd got 20, but hey, I'm going to get going and talking too.
Okay.
But okay. That's all right. All right, so I'm going to get going on this. Bear with me. No, okay. The title of the presentation has been shared with you already. It was work prepared by myself and my colleague Matthew Smith. Matthew, sorry, getting tongue-tied here. I'd like to point out that this that the presentation today is an abbreviated version of a much longer one called Positive Psychology Post-Pandemic, and both of these presentations can now be found in full on ResearchGate under my name. Certainly Matthew's for the longer one, but you'll find these slides on ResearchGate if you want to look at them. And ResearchGate is one word, researchgate.net. Who are we? Matthew and I essentially wrote, prepared, designed an MSc in Applied Positive Psychology at Buckinghamshire University. And I shared that with him for 8 years before my retirement a couple of years ago. So in approaching this subject, I want to set the scene and then look at a possible response. Now, in setting a scene, it's important to recognize whether we ask questions about the pandemic now or post-pandemic. Basically, what we are seeing now are themes that will continue. That when we move into a post-pandemic phase, it won't be as if everything suddenly becomes easier. These themes will continue. The question becomes, what are the themes? To prepare this work, I want to acknowledge at the outset that all the research work I've done on this is based on sources in the United Kingdom. Now, I respect that may be different in other countries, so please feel free to judge that for yourself and grasp perhaps or focus on what matters most to you. Like many other people, I was locked down from March last year. I had 3 separate lockdowns. I was also ill. So essentially I had a long time, in theory, confined. And what I chose to do was respect that this was a moment in history and to look in detail at what was appearing publicly about the pandemic. So the sources for me were the BBC News web pages, published reports, the Guardian newspaper, and the British Office of National Statistics. And what I did with what was essentially hundreds and hundreds of pages of essentially reports and data, was a thematic analysis for the purposes of a bigger presentation and then moving towards a positive psychology response. Now, as we approach this, respecting that we've all had 18, frankly, very unique, very difficult months, it's relevant and important to say that all the work suggests that strains present now, sorry, please let me get that straight, pre-existing strains in society and then in the pandemic are amplified and concentrated in this environment. And it's quite natural that many of us may feel overwhelmed by this. So as we go through this material, I would say both respect those possible feelings and care for yourself as you listen. The presentation will arrive at what I would call choices and possibility. And I'd use an expression President Joe Biden did late last year, and when he said, resist becoming numb to the sorrow essentially that this pandemic has created. So shifting into what I found, I'm going to summarize themes in the data and the possible psychological impact of those themes. Now, again, this is abbreviated. There's a detail in the longer presentation if you wish to look at it. But no surprise, part of the themes include the experience of bereavement, massive impact on health staff, that the pandemic has highlighted and increased inequalities across certainly British society, and these include gender, socioeconomic, minorities, and disabilities. There's been a clear impact on mental health, a clear impact on the delivery of education. The kind of psychological impacts emerging are coping with loss, experience of mental health problems, what I would call altered sense of self, change of hope towards the future, and an ability or a questioning of our own ability to be able to respond to that. Now, in turning to what we might do, what kind of a model might we turn to shift psychological influences, or at least one model, one choice. Now, in the context of the work I've done on the Masters in Applied Positive Psychology, we always work on the principle, start from the inside. It's learn and change from the inside out and encourage others to do the same. And that, to frame that in another way, an expression attributed to Gandhi is be the change you seek to create. So what we're doing here is suggesting ways in which we as individuals might support ourselves coming through the pandemic more positively. And in the act of finding something positive for ourselves, can we share it with others? Now, generically, and respecting that there may be many people in the audience unfamiliar with positive psychology, I'm going to talk in general terms, but then point you towards a source where you can get plain language support on this if you wish. There's 3 psychological steps: buffering, as in protecting ourselves, bolstering, strengthening ourselves, and then possibilities for building change. Now, this is a very generic description that's found in a very high quality, very large paper that is referenced on the slides if you wish to find them on ResearchGate. Now, what I've done here is create a model from the themes I found. So this, as you might be picking up in what I said, I cluster themes into 2 broad areas: seeing ourselves and seeing others. So can we adjust how we see ourselves based on the impact of the pandemic, move to a more positive place? And in the act of doing that for ourselves, can we support others, as in see others more positively than we might be doing? Now, for me, that presents or creates the possibility of a cycle of recovery and change. Now, the cycle is starting with oneself, and in broad terms, the choices that might be possible include reconnecting with our best self, reconnecting with our strengths, a development of hope, and a development of realistic optimism. So this is for in ourselves, seeing myself. If we can find that in ourselves, what we have the capacity to do is to actually look for those things in others as well. So if I know what's the best self in me, maybe I can be looking for the best self in others. if I can see what the strengths are in me, maybe I can be seeing the strengths in others. Maybe I can also draw on possible research-based practices from positive psychology, such as gratitude, acts of kindness, love and compassion, and others that are essentially evidence-based ways of creating positive change. Now, let me say these in slightly more detail. And I have to confess, I've lost track of time. So if anybody wants to prompt me, feel free. So saying this in slightly more detail, if one uses the expression best self, this has two directions. If I look back, is there an occasion when I can say, I recognize a point in time, a point of experience has been the best in me? Is there a way of turning back to that, reconnecting with it, drawing on it? Is there a way of looking forward and saying, I would like to work towards to a best self in me? Now, that's two ways of perhaps approaching this. In looking for the strengths in us, and there's a lot of evidence that suggests that large numbers of people, probably over 50%, don't have a language for the strengths in themselves. So can we find ways of owning and working with our own strengths? There's a particular website that is a superb base for these ideas, and it's viacharacter.org. That's one word, viacharacter.org. The practice of hope psychologically comprises of three elements: having a goal, having willpower, and having a way to approach something. So if we feel we've dropped in hope, if we spend time focusing on those three places, the goal, the willpower, creating a means or an approach, then the likelihood is of our hope going up. Now, essentially, my argument, my proposal is practicing these over time, consistently towards ourselves, and reflecting these in others will bolster well-being. So best self could be who was I pre-pandemic? Who am I now? How have I changed? What have I lost? What do I want to get back? Embody the gifts you had and have and don't wish to lose. Now, I'm going through this at a gallop given the time constraints. I'd also say positive psychology offers approaches that affect you and others. I mentioned them briefly, but I would call these positive social psychology, ways of responding to others that influence well-being in others. What I mean by that is gratitude, compassion, self-compassion, acts of kindness, what's called active constructive responding, all of which in relationship with others shift well-being. So broadly, that's the summary. In the context of the time constraints, that's why I've galloped. I've pointed towards them verbally. If you're drawn to this, what I would suggest is go to ResearchGate, search my name, and you will find this presentation slides available to you easily. If you're unfamiliar with positive psychology, what I would say is visiting viacharacter.org becomes a great resource for looking at the strengths in you, the best in you, and ways these might be brought into being. What the presentation also has is a reference to a major piece of work by some of the biggest practitioners in the world on positive psychology that looks at choices and options in positive psychology as a whole. My own focus has been on themes I saw in the data. That's what's underpinned the presentation today.
Great.
That's it as a Gallup, and I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Piers. Okay, Jeremy, go ahead.
All right, can people see my screen here?
Yeah, it's not full page, but we can certainly see it. Yeah.
Got it.
Now it is. Yeah, you're in presenter view now. Great, thanks.
Thank you. And Piers, thank you so much. And also, I would ask you to leave on your video. I can't see the crowd, but I can see you, and I can see Allison, and I draw strength and vigor from your faces. And when, hi Dan, and if I make a joke and you laugh and pretend to laugh a bit more than what you actually feel, that's great. That'll propel me. So I want to talk briefly, I'll set my timer here. I want to talk briefly about a paper, but I also want to introduce you all to what I think you can consider an emerging space, but you should take that with a grain of salt, because when someone describes their own research as an emerging space, that's a bit self-serving, I think. And just, you know, I do stutter a little bit. That's actually why I go by Jer. My full name is Jeremy, but I would get stuck on my name, and I used to hate to meet people because I would get stuck on my name. But my first day in college, I was saying my name to someone. I met someone, I got stuck on my name, and I was like, shoot. And they cut me off and said, Jer, that's a great name. And I was like, good idea. And since then, I've been Jer. So if you see me on the street, please do call me Jer, and I will get stuck a little bit during this talk, and I would appreciate your patience. Okay. So people often make very broad statements about the world as a whole. Let's talk about a couple of them. Life is suffering. That is a broad statement. That's the first of the four noble truths. Forrest Gump makes the statement, life is not suffering, it's a box of chocolates. You don't know what you're going to get. So life is good, but you can't predict it. We've looked on Twitter at 80,000 tweets, and this is a word cloud that captures claims about the world as a whole that you find on Twitter. So the world is boring, the world is pissing me off, the world is a shithole. These are the sorts of claims that are made about the world as a whole. Only, depending on how you count, only a couple of these beliefs has been studied. One is the belief in a just world. This is the belief that you get what you deserve and deserve what you get. And it's tied to a whole bunch of different outcomes and not just correlational research, but mostly correlational. And in general, people who see the world as a fair place tend to work hard because they think they'll be rewarded for their hard work. They tend to be nicer because you don't want to be a jerk, because that will come back to bite you. You tend to be more successful and happy, but you also tend to blame victims. So it's not just all good things. If you're poor, the assumption is, well, maybe you deserved it. You did something to be poor. Maybe you didn't work hard enough. What about other world beliefs? So I study primal world beliefs, which are basic beliefs about the world as a whole, as if it was one giant place. Basically, what are your trait beliefs of what the world is typically like? We spent 6 years trying to identify a big five-like taxonomy of worldview. Like, what are the major world beliefs that people hold? This had not yet been done. We had a whole bunch of input, so we had all those tweets, we had focus groups, we had hundreds of quotes from the most influential texts in the history of the world. We basically threw hundreds of questions that we found, hundreds of ideas into different factor analyses, and we published our results of 6 years of work. And just to be clear, it's not that the project took 6 years. I did nothing else for 6 years except this. And the first big thing we found is people disagree in 26 ways about the fundamental nature of the world as a whole. Belief in a just world is just scratching the surface of those ways. These beliefs are stable across time. They're about as stable as big five traits. So as much as optimism or extroversion or agreeableness. Also to Piers, it's worth to note that during the pandemic, these primal world beliefs haven't really changed, which is a bit of a surprise. These beliefs don't really correlate to demographics. Now, this is cool on 2 points. One is you can't tell someone's primals from their background. So you see me as a white person in the US. So does that mean that I believe that the world is fair and abundant? No. In fact, race does not have, seems to have a large bearing. The belief that the world is abundant is not tied to being rich or to being poor. And also what this means is that you can't tell what someone's most basic beliefs about the world are by just looking at them. And primals are highly correlated to well-being and personality, but well-being comes with an asterisk because these correlations are based on one MTurk study with a preliminary version of our inventory. That's not good enough. We need better correlational data. But the effect sizes that we found are huge, typically in the 0.4, 0.5, even 0.6 range. So what are the primals? And I'll move through this real fast. What we found is basically 22 patterns in the data. Fortunately, 17 of them fall into 3 clusters. The first cluster, and we call this a big 3 safe. So I bet that's a bit prideful to compare our big 3 to the big 5, but it's what we call it in-house. So the belief that the world is safe versus dangerous is the first big cluster. The second one is the belief that the world is enticing versus dull. And to be clear, I'm saying versus so you know the meaning of what it means to score low. All of these subscales have both forward and reverse scored questions that load well, so we really know exactly what it means to score low on each of these continuums. The third one is the belief the world is alive versus mechanistic, which is the belief that the world is imbued with intention, that interacts with you and needs your help for an important task. Safe, enticing, and alive in turn co-correlate with each other. And so the general factor is the world a good or bad place? Some people see the world as a shithole. Some people have a genuine belief that the world is a terrible place, that it is dangerous, it is dull, and it is a machine, it is mindless. And some people see the world as safe, enticing, and alive. And the belief that the world is good, as you might expect, tend to be most predictive of most things. However, we had to keep all of these other beliefs because in prediction contests, they were very predictive of important outcomes to different extents. So this is an emerging research topic that's being studied around the world, and there's translation efforts that are going on. We got a grant at Penn where we're doing a lot of fun stuff. One is which is that we're trying to give away money. And my people would be annoyed at me if I didn't mention September 26th, if you want to apply for a 250K or 125K grants, 2-page LOIs are due September 26th. And we're taking proposals in clinical, positive, health, organizational, political psych, and those others to really try to explore what these beliefs are doing. Only a few of them have been studied, and we don't really know what they do and what they are, although we have a lot of ideas. Now I'm going to talk to you briefly. I have 6-ish more minutes from my clock about what primals predict well-being. Primals should, according to Beck, he designed CBT on the underlying premise that beliefs that are very much like this shape your affect and behavior. So he would probably say that negative primal should lead to lower well-being and perhaps less success too. However, it might not be true. Life satisfaction, for instance, is often understood as a comparison of your life against a reference norm, which might be a general belief about what the world is like. So if you have a mediocre life, in a bad world, that's a pretty good life. Like, well done. If you have a mediocre life in a good world where it could have been a lot better, then maybe you would be less satisfied with your life. So it really could go both ways. We really do need to do correlational research just to know what primals predict well-being. We also are very interested in addressing meta-beliefs, which are beliefs about beliefs that might be a major reason why people adopt negative primal world beliefs in the first place. So for instance, Prince Humperdinck says, "I always think everything could be a trap, which is why I'm still alive." And I think there's two things that are going on here. First, Humperdinck sees the world as a dangerous place. Secondly, he thinks it's good for him. It keeps him safe. It's healthy. It has kept him alive. So we want to see, is seeing the world as a dangerous place tied to being more healthy? Maybe it's the case that you're more attuned to threats and you can spot when someone's out to get you or when a car is going to hit you. You check both ways and so on and so forth. And there's a whole bunch of other ways that we know that people believe that seeing the world in a bad way might help them. So for instance, that second one there, we've heard from cops that seeing the world as a dangerous place, people think helps them be good at their job. So we ran two studies. The first one, we asked parents to demonstrate, do people actually think that there is value, net gains to seeing the world as a bad place? And we asked parents what primals they want to pass on to their kids. And basically, what we found was normal distributions. What that means is many parents, substantial clumps of parents, want to teach their kids that the world is a bad place, whether it's dangerous or competitive or about to fall apart or unjust. And so on and so forth. And I think they mean well. They want to help their kids. They think that it's going to help their kids to teach them that the world is in different ways a bad place. What it also means is that many parents think that teaching their kids that the world is a little bit good is good, but teaching them that the world is very good can lead to a whole bunch of bad outcomes. I'm short on time, but basically what we found was, and I'll jump to this, seeing the world as a good place is tied to being more successful, but just a little bit. It's tied to liking your job more, being more satisfied with your job by quite a bit. It's tied to health. And so this is in 6 samples, a much bigger group of people, about 5,000 people. Seeing the world as a good place is tied to increased health. It's tied to fewer negative emotions by quite a bit. These effect sizes are starting to get pretty big. Big differences in depression outcomes. You tend to, you're more at risk of committing suicide or having committed suicide in the past if you see the world as a bad place, especially if you see the world as having no role for you to play, which is consistent with a lot of suicide theory. And it's tied to seeing the world as a bad place is tied to having much worse life satisfaction and much worse overall well-being. This is the relationship between seeing the world as enticing and overall psychological flourishing. So this clear pattern has emerged. And also there seems to be no benefit to seeing the world as a slightly good place as opposed to a very good place. In all of the t-tests that we looked at, seeing the world as a very good place was tied to better outcomes. Now, the takeaways here is that those with more positive primals on average enjoy better well-being outcomes, though to different extents depending on the outcome. And causation is still unknown. There's also no correlational basis for the approach of wanting to teach your kids slightly positive beliefs, but not very positive beliefs. Although the way that we looked at this was quite crude, we could be more sophisticated. But we do know that very positive primals just simply aren't debilitating. So I'm still processing what this means, and I'm about to close up here. I recently became a parent. and I'm teaching my kid and thinking about what primals do I want to pass on to my kid, and she's beginning to grow up a little bit more. And I think what this means is that parents who want to teach negative primals to their kids could be doing their kids an enormous disservice. And I think what's going on is that the belief that the world is a good place is not a belief of what the world is always like. It's what the belief the world is typically like, given a lack of information. It's a trait belief. It allows for exceptions. Your kids, just like you, can't escape the world. I think a belief about a world is a little bit like a belief about your spouse. If you can't escape your spouse, if you can't escape a situation, all that's left is determining whether you have decided if you want to be here. So I'm hopeful that I can figure out a way to teach my kid to be safe, to be cautious, and so on and so forth, but also teach them that the world is a wondrous and quite safe place. Thanks for your time.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. We'll now. Oh, sorry about that. Thanks, Jeremy. We'll now continue on with Allison.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Parente, and I am currently a second-year clinical psychology doctoral student at Farleigh Dickinson University. And as mentioned earlier, I will be discussing the topic, are strength-based positive interventions effective for eliciting positive behavioral outcomes, a meta-analytic review. So really quickly, I wanted to recognize my co-authors, Drs. Justine Bates-Krakoff, Dr. Robert McGrath, Dr. Tayyab Rashid, and Ryan Nemec. Okay, so there we go. Positive psychology, as mentioned a little bit earlier, was founded by Martin Seligman based on the belief that people want to lead meaningful and fulfilling lives and cultivate what is best within themselves. And to study what is best in people can be seen as the mission of positive psychology, and helping people to uncover, explore, and practice their strengths is essential to this approach. Associated with its emergence was an increased emphasis on enhancing positive human functioning, contributing to feelings of well-being, and helping individuals to flourish and thrive. Researchers and clinicians quickly picked up on this call, developing new approaches for improving functioning that will be referred to here as positive psychology interventions, or you'll hear me say PPIs. So strength-based positive interventions are treatment methods or activities aimed at cultivating positive feelings, behaviors, or cognitions. Much of the research conducted in the field of positive psychology has focused on the effectiveness of these interventions. So Nemec defined character strengths as positive personality qualities that reflect core identity, produce positive outcomes for oneself and others, and contribute to common good. And Peterson and Seligman distinguished character strengths from other positive attributes such as talents, forms of intelligence, resources, and values in two ways. First, character strengths seem to be universally perceived as contributing not only to individuals, but as the community as a whole. And second, while character strengths are stable, they are also perceived as malleable and therefore open to intervention, while talents and resources are more fixed. So the extensive model of these strengths is offered by the VIA classification of character strengths and virtues, which Dr. Worth had mentioned. And the classification includes 24 character strengths, such as creativity, gratitude, and self-regulation. So one implication of the focus on character strengths is that strengths-based positive intervention strategies intending to enhance those strengths have the potential to result in positive outcomes for the individual. Because of this focus on the positive rather than on a diagnosis, any positive intervention is potentially applicable to a variety of problems. So Sin and Leo Bermirsky clarified the concept of PPIs as treatment methods or intentional activities that aim to cultivate positive feelings, behaviors, or cognitions. This definition encompasses both clinically relevant interventions and more informal strategies that can, for example, include counseling on life problems, coaching, or self-help activities. So the resulting literature, therefore, includes studies with both clinical and non-clinical populations. Substantial literature has since emerged evaluating the effectiveness of these types of interventions. As you can see up here, 9 recent reviews specifically focused on positive interventions associated with positive psychology. All drew positive conclusions about the effectiveness of these interventions, although a concern raised about existing research on PPIs, one that is the focus of the present investigation, is an overemphasis on certain classes of outcomes, specifically focusing on experiential variables such as self-reported depression or subjective well-being. And so Shute and Malouf noted that future research should focus on a broader variety of outcomes, maybe such as work-related outcomes or health-related behavioral outcomes. While several authors have suggested the importance of looking at how well PPIs and/or SBPIs influence behavior, to date, no review of the literature exists focusing on this very important issue for any type of intervention. So now we get to the current study. Outcomes examined in positive intervention research is important because the popularity of positive psychology has resulted from a belief that it offers an alternative to established therapies focusing on correcting deficiencies. So one example is the potential for PPIs to be used as freestanding treatments, as does the existence of material discussing positive psychotherapy as a treatment option. Since behavior change is an essential ingredient in many treatment contexts, for example, behavioral activation, academic engagement, smoking cessation, this belief cannot be valid if PPIs are only effective at changing self-perceptions. So the purpose of the present meta-analysis was to synthesize evidence concerning SBPIs as contributors to behavior change, as opposed to emotional and affective perceptions. So in terms of our methods, in the first search, a lengthy list of terms that could potentially indicate a character strength was developed through a review of literature and discussion among contributors of the study. As you can see here, here's a lengthy list. And once this list was compiled, a systematic literature search was conducted using the databases here, spanning all records from initiation of the database until February 2018. Identified studies had to include one or more terms from here, and plus one or more of the following terms seen here: therapy, treatment, etc. And the initial search generated 769,202 references. And here is the Prisma diagram that shows how we achieved these numbers. So we decided to limit inclusion to SBPIs rather than PPIs in general. We also made the decision to include literature that clearly emerged under the influence of the positive psychology movement and that focused on strength enhancement regardless of reference to the movement. And then our last decision we made was the review was not limited to studies examining what could be considered clinical interventions. As noted earlier, use of PPIs has explicitly been encouraged in counseling or coaching as well as clinical work. So to quickly summarize, the meta-analysis focused on the use of SBPIs, broadly conceived, to enhance outcomes likely to be indicative of behavioral functioning across both clinical and non-clinical samples. So here is the following criteria for inclusion were adopted. To note, the study included an intervention that focused on at least one of the strengths listed in the previous slide, and at least one outcome measure reflected a change in participant behavior rather than an emotional experience or attitude. So this could have included both self-reported and independently observed behavior changes. Now I want to go back here. So of the final 393 that were thought to be potential candidates for inclusion, 316 included no behavioral criteria. Thus, almost all studies done on SBPIs relied exclusively on experiential outcomes, and the final pool consisted of only 16 articles. So that's when we decided, due to the small sample from search 1, we decided to do a second search, which you can see over here. This was repeated from February 2018 to October 2020. And this time we limited the search to PsycInfo and ERIC databases because all studies generated from the first search were present in one of those two sources. And this search generated 30,121 references, of which only 13 met the criteria. So again, the primary cause of exclusion was the absence of behavioral outcomes. So across 29 articles, 48 analyses were available that examined group differences in which was deemed a behavioral outcome at post-test, we decided it was important to at least provide preliminary results for several potentially important and intuitively compelling candidates for moderators of effect sizes. And so the following were extracted. So for example, delivery system, was it live versus online? Monitoring, was it self-guided or therapist-guided? Okay, now on to the statistical analyses and results. Statistics were computed using comprehensive meta-analysis version 3.0, given variations in the populations, interventions, outcome variables. Results from the random effects model were reported, and estimates of heterogeneity and small sample bias were also generated, as well as exploratory meta-regression analyses were conducted, recognizing the results could only be considered preliminary. So in terms of effect size, we used Hedges G, which is a standardized mean difference similar to Cohen's D, but is less biased estimator used to equally weigh group standard deviations. And when comparing the active treatment and control groups, we found an analysis of pre-test data suggested that there was little difference between group means, Hedges G of 0.07. However, at post-test, we found a small to medium effect size of 0.32. So this suggests right here that strength-based positive interventions were on average effective. And increasingly, it's considered important in meta-analyses to consider the possibility that authors selectively reported results and to test for this possibility. So we looked at risk of bias in accordance with the PRISMA guidelines, and potential contributors to bias were evaluated based on guidelines by the Cochrane Collaboration's tools for assessing risk of bias, and we found it did not have an effect on our overall conclusion. And this leads to our final discussion. So just to summarize, across 29 studies, SPPIs had a small, statistically significant effect on behavioral outcomes. It is noteworthy that this level is consistent with results from other meta-analyses that focused on similar behavior change variables. And the associations between SPPIs and behavioral outcomes observed in the current meta-analysis are consistent with results for other intervention approaches. Evaluation of bias was problematic given the number of instances in which insufficient information was provided to make a judgment. So with these caveats in mind, effects seem consistent with more established approaches to behavior change. One of the most important challenges raised by this meta-analysis is the need for broader research into PPIs and in particular SBPIs. Positive interventions and PPIs have been touted as an alternative or supplement to symptom-based techniques, and the results of our meta-analysis are consistent with this assertion as are other recent studies that have directly compared positive interventions with symptom-focused interventions. And these findings also raise the intriguing possibility that positive interventions could provide a useful adjunct to more problem-centered solutions. And lastly, just a few limitations I wanted to touch upon. The tendency among researchers examining the value of SBPIs to focus on a small set of outcomes means a great deal more work is needed on the topic. And most studies focus exclusively, as I mentioned, on affective and experiential variables. So ultimately, with the pool of 29 studies, there is currently insufficient basis for drawing firm conclusions regarding when and for whom SBPIs may be the most appropriate behavior change techniques. For those interested in PPIs, it would be beneficial to consider broadening the set of outcome measures they examine, along with studies generally provided insufficient information about training and expertise of the treatment providers. So future research can focus on this and would also benefit from increased attention to detailed description of the circumstances of treatment. Also, future research can focus on the effectiveness of positive interventions and always including behavioral as well as emotional affective outcomes. So this meta-analysis should encourage existing training for psychologists and other mental health professionals to further explore the benefits of SBPIs on behavioral outcomes. And that is it.
Well, you finished right on time. Thank you for that, Allison. So there's quite a few requests for your guys' contact information so that people could follow up and get copies of your PowerPoints or your research. So I do see at Clinton J at sas.upenn.edu. Is that correct?
Yeah, Clifton J.
I'm sorry, Clifton J, right, of course. And then Piers has already provided his ResearchGate link to us. It's earlier in the text thread. And Allison, Allison, did you put your email address in here?
I'm just about to, so I'll put that in.
Okay, that's great. And so we don't have a lot of time left, but I'm just wondering about a question for Allison. The strength-based psychological interventions. I'm a little bit surprised that you were only able to come up with 29 studies. So can you just comment to that? So what was the limiting, and I think you did touch upon it, but what were kind of the limiting factors there again, as far as being able to find them or find research on them?
So yes, this was a bit surprising to me as well, considering we started off in the first search with over 700,000 and in the second search over 30,000. But the main factor was that we were unable to find studies that had behavioral outcomes. So the majority of the studies would focus on well-being or depression. I'm trying to think of other specific ones, but we weren't finding, for example, some of the studies we did find, the behaviors were alcohol consumption or engagement or GPA. So things that were physically, like, were behavioral outcomes and changes. And I think that going back to your question, we had to look into the specific surveys that they used and to make sure that there was a behavioral component to those surveys. So it's very nitty-gritty, and we often found that there weren't for a lot of different factors that we did want to use. So we ultimately had to exclude those.
Mm-hmm. So the issue of self-report measures, or self-reporting, is just, I guess it's not sufficiently demonstrative of change. Is that the idea?
Yes, I believe so. And I think it also depended on so we did have self-report measurements, but some of them were just fully focused on affective and experiential variables and didn't pull any behavioral measures.
Right.
So we couldn't use that to pull as one of our studies, so then it would take the whole study out.
Okay. So there's a question here for Jeremy regarding the big 5 and the big 3 primals, which you identified. Can you elaborate more on the mapping between a big 5 and the big 3 primals? Example, say neuroticism mapped to what, to a primal, for example?
Sure. Well, quickly, belief that the world is a dangerous place is tied to being more neurotic. The belief that the world is enticing is tied to being a curious person who is open to experiences. Alive is very closely related with being a spiritual person, as you might expect. So a lot of these big effect sizes that we're seeing are exactly along the lines of, if you see a situation in X way, does Y behavior make sense? But what's also fun too is that there's some things that we don't expect. So for instance, the belief the world is a dangerous place. People have thought in the past that would predict being a political conservative.
Right.
And we've done a lot of work now, and we're submitting a paper to Psych Science, fingers crossed, showing that that's not the case at all, that we've made a big mistake, and that conservatives and liberals actually see the world as equally safe, and where they disagree is in relationship to other beliefs that we did not expect as much.
Yeah, so what of the 3 then is more tied to someone's political beliefs then, or none of them? Or?
Well, the big 3 is actually not where you want to look. You might recall that we found 22 patterns, and most of them cluster into the belief the world is good, but 5 of them are kind of on their own, doing their own thing. And one of them is the belief that the world is an inherently hierarchical place where differences imply something is better or worse. So what is your assumption when you approach difference? Does it just meaningless in the sense that things are just different, it's fine? Or does it imply one thing might be better or worse than something else? And conservatives tend to assume that it implies better or worseness, and liberals tend to assume that it implies nothing. Both of those extremes are a bit absurd, and that's not my point, but it's a profound different thing to say that conservatism might stem from a threat response versus it might stem from a fundamentally different approach to the nature of difference, which I think is quite fun and exciting.
So Florencio has a question here. I'm trying to sort of make sense of it, but does personality trait define what primal to take, or is it bidirectional? Like, for example, define to drive, he says. Can you see the text thread? Does personality trait define which primal to take?
Well, I think you're trying to wonder how closely related these concepts are. And I think that I'll use my mother as a case study, right? My mother is a extroverted, funny, outgoing person. I get a lot of my best traits from my mom. She's also convinced that the world is a dangerous place. We find in our studies that seeing the world as a dangerous place does make you less optimistic and definitely less outgoing. The correlations are large, like 0.4, 0.5. But you can definitely see the world as bad and scary and dangerous and so on and so forth and still be an outgoing person. So I think there's like temperament involved. And like your genetic predisposition of certain temperaments of some sort. I don't know what that means. But I also think that you can have conflicting primals and your temperament. And if you have conflicting ones, maybe you'll end up with your patterns of thought and action, you'll fall somewhere right in the middle. Who knows? We're not sure yet.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, it's very different presentations today. I apologize, Piers, we weren't able to get to you at all, but appreciate all three of your presentations. We are kind of running out of time here a bit, but again, thanks for all three of you coming. Piers, did you have something to say? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as I typed into the chat, I was stunned and moved and excited by Piers' work, Allison's work. Really loved it. You're doing great stuff.
Yeah. No, it's really great. Good stuff. Thank you all, and we'll see you in one of the other sessions. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
To find where the treasure lies. I want to hear that small voice whisper to my forgotten soul. They say it's never too late to start again. What breaks your heart will make